Welcome back to CBSN Originals. I'm Ed O'Keefe. Many immigrants cite gang violence as a key reason they decide to leave their home countries and seek refuge here in the United States. In El Salvador, it's estimated that nearly 60,000 people are members of a gang. That's more than the country's police force. One of the deadliest gangs in El Salvador is MS-13, but the gang got its start here in the United States. I spoke with Hannah Dreier, an immigration reporter for the investigative outlet ProPublica, who has extensive experience covering MS-13. So let's start with the basics. Let's get as 101 as possible. How did MS-13 start?
So MS-13 is not new. It's been around since the 80s, and it was actually founded here in the US, in Los Angeles. People fleeing civil war in El Salvador came to Los Angeles, and sort of for protection, they formed this gang, and the gang then metastasized and spread back to Central America and all around the US.
And remind us what MS actually even stands for.
So this is Mara Salvatrucha. It's basically like badass Salvadoran gang. And 13, there are a lot of interpretations of why that number is there. But I think the most common is that it's for the number in the alphabet that M falls on.
Got it. Outside of the United States and El Salvador, are there any other countries that see large representation of MS-13?
Yeah, MS-13 is all around the Northern Triangle, so Honduras, the other Central American countries, and then the US. Those are the main places. There's some MS-13 presence in other countries, like maybe a little bit in Mexico, a little bit on the border. But it's not like this global gang with outposts in every country.
What, if anything, has the Salvadoran government been doing, certainly in recent years, to try to combat its rise and its continued dominance?
So El Salvador has had this very controversial mano dura strategy where they've had death squads and other really brutal ways to crack down on the gang. One problem is that the gang has infiltrated a lot of the government security apparatus. So there are gang members in the police, there are gang members in the military, and the government is sometimes being used by the gang to crack down on gang rivals. And then other times there are these death squads that are going out and doing these extrajudicial killings of gang members. And the result has been really just chaos in El Salvador.
Mano dura, of course, means strong hand. The idea being that they're literally trying to use aggressive force to combat its spread there in El Salvador and across the other countries. Do members of the gang today have historical reference to the 80s when the gang began? Do they understand why it began, where it began?
So I've been doing a lot of reporting with the youngest members of the gang in the US. These are 16 and 17-year-old kids. Some of them were born here and some of them are immigrants. Some of them were recruited by the gang here, not in their home countries. And what they tell me is that in their understanding, the gang is an expression of Central American pride. And it's a way that Central Americans can unify to stand up against people who might attack them or might want to do them harm. I don't get the sense that a lot of these kids really understand the whole trajectory from LA to Central America, back to the US, and the way that cycle has played out. But there's definitely a sense that this is something that's here for us, and I think that that was part of the founding of the gang. You know, a group of people who felt very in the crosshairs back in the 80s. You
said something interesting there. You said you're talking to 16 and 17-year-olds who in some cases have been recruited into the gang since they've been in the United States, not back in El Salvador, but here.
This is something that law enforcement tells me again and again, that when they're coming across MS-13 members, it's usually that the kids have been recruited in their high schools, in the streets of their new neighborhoods on Long Island. This isn't a gang with huge superstructures. It's not a gang that really has the organizational ability to send people to seed new gang groups in the US. What's mostly happening is young kids come here, they're adrift, they don't speak English sometimes, they're lonely. You know, it's hard to get to a new place. And that's when the gang sort of pounces. And these kids tell me gang members will sit down in like the lunchroom and say, hey, why don't you hang out with us? And little by little, they're recruited that way.
And those gang members are their age?
Yeah, it's a very young gang. Some of the leaders committing the worst violence outside of DC and outside of New York are 15, 16 years old. There's like 19-year-olds leading big cliques of this gang. And that's something that's been very disturbing for me to see, and I think it's disturbing for the law enforcement officials trying to crack down on this gang. I mean, it's kids.
And I think to some the answer to this is obvious, perhaps to others it isn't, but I mean, how come the parents don't necessarily notice that their kid is joining a gang, and how come they can't seem to stop them from doing so?
I mean, that's an issue that comes up not just with MS-13.
Right.
It's hard with teenagers to ever know what's going on with them. I mean, when I'm talking to these people, they're constantly lying to me. At this point, I demand to see people's cell phones to know what really is going on and if they're telling the truth or not. A lot of these parents are working, they're in a new culture. That all contributes to how hard it is, I think, to know what your kid is doing, but that's something that every parent grapples with. And with these kids, it just seems like there's not a lot of other alternatives for them. There aren't other activities for them. And so they're sort of funneled into this bad direction.
It sounds to some extent, and if you look at the crimes they commit, it's almost as if they're bored, right? And this is helping fill the void?
Totally. I mean, at this point, I've looked through a lot of their Facebook conversations. A lot of these groups are networked on social media, and they'll be talking about crushes in high school and, you know, how they're going to sell marijuana, how they're going to smoke marijuana in the woods, and then just interspersed will be some reference to a murder. Like nothing, but just all mixed in with these normal sort of teenage chat topics. And it does seem like for some of these kids, it's all playing out on the same level. Like somebody trash talked you in school, maybe you're going to do violence to them, or maybe you're just going to complain with your friends about them. And it's not more sophisticated than that, as far as I can tell.
It's just a pretty vicious cycle for them, I'm sure. Look, when you hear folks here in Washington talking about this issue, about MS-13 or about gang violence in Central America and how it manifests itself here in the States, what are the biggest maybe misperceptions based on your reporting, your understanding of it, that are worth dispelling?
I mean, I think the most important thing to see is that this is really a local policing issue. And right now, MS-13 is being talked about as this border issue, when really, if you talk to FBI agents and police chiefs on the ground, they'll tell you that this is a gang that needs to be tackled like any other street gang, with local police initiatives. And instead, right now, I hear a lot of talk about strengthening the border to try to crack down on MS-13 criminals, when really it's not a gang that is trying to send people in any organized way across the border. It's a gang that is trying to recruit people who are already here in the US. And when you look at the numbers, it's something like 200 people have been caught at the border who were later found to be MS-13 members. The numbers are tiny. And yet MS-13 is doing real violence, and real violence mostly to other Latino people. And so it seems very important to be realistic about what this gang is so that law enforcement can really crack down on it.
Well, Hannah Dreier is the reporter covering immigration and the issues related to it for the investigative news outlet ProPublica. We thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Oh, thank you for talking about this.